Okay, so hello everybody again. I will first say a few words about this workshop. You are about to participate in an experiment, the first of its kind in the history of psychotherapy. We have invited clinicians and scholars from three groups: hardcore psychodynamics, hardcore CBT, together with people from the integration movement. Unfortunately, these groups rarely talk to each other and rarely pay interest to what the other is doing. On the rare occasions that hardcore clinicians from each camp meet, they tend to fight and show hostility toward the other. In philosophy, the state of mind of the otherness is a state of being different from and alien to a person's social identity and to the identity of the self. There is rich philosophical literature about how we can make a dialogue with the other and enrich ourselves from an authentic meeting with otherness. And we want to use some of this literature, which Yael will shortly speak about, to help us with this experiment. In these 3 days, we will experiment. I believe each of you will meet people who share similar views, but also views that you will experience as awkward, false, and maybe distorting. For example, I know that sitting in this room here are people with opposing views about empirical research, the aims of therapy, and many, many other core questions. The experiment is basically this: can we take someone from the other, take something from the other, without accepting his or her view, and be enriched by it, even though their opinions look strange, unacceptable, and incompatible with my own views? This experiment uses the metaphor of guest and hospitality to promote an enriching dialogue with the other. We suppose and assume that being a guest and being a host brings about a unique attitude toward the other, enabling openness and dialogue and maintaining a solid identity. We are not sure of the result of this experiment. Maybe it will fail. Perhaps the human mind is incapable of such openness. Perhaps it will lead to other unexpected results. In any case, we record it, we document it, and the purpose of the group will be to provide a report, a case study of what we're doing here, and to the whole process. So, Yael will tell you more about the theoretical background of this experiment, and then we will start the panels. Okay?
Maybe for the lecture, some words on the changes in schedule today. You didn't read the song you wanted to.
Oh yes, we have a beautiful song. We will read it soon. Yes.
Okay. So today, because 3 of the participants won't be with us, there are 2 panels. In the first session, there will be Stephen Frosch and Valant Shachar, and the second panel will be John Mills and Idana Berta. We apologize for the changes. So first of all, I will ask you to forgive me from reading from the paper. English is not my mother tongue, and I'm only a guest in this language. Louder. Yeah. Okay. Before we begin the workshop on hospitality and psychotherapy integration, we must explain what is hospitality, what does hospitality and psychotherapy integration mean, in response to what problems does it arise, what questions does it come to answer, how can it be implanted, and finally, how will it be applied in this workshop. 17 years ago, Wachtel said the following things, which are still true today. When you have two clinicians up here and they're savvy to each other, it's a bit rough. What I am hoping for, and still am, is first of all dialogue. I think one of the things that struck me was that there was very little dialogue among theoretical orientations. I think SEPI has been very successful, but there is still a lot of separate worlds. They don't hear each other, don't know about each other, that don't take each other seriously, and most of all, don't learn from each other. The problem we identify and seek to address in the area of psychotherapy integration is the persistent loyalty of those who adhere to monolithic schools of thought, who do not see an essential goal in integration and dialogue with other approaches. When this loyalty to a single theory is an obstacle to the psychotherapy field development and the growth of the monolithic schools themselves. This problem of loyalty is especially true when it comes to the two most central schools in the field, psychoanalysis and the psychodynamic approach based on its principle, and the cognitive behavioral approach. Despite the development of psychotherapy and the diversity of approaches in the field, the psychodynamic and cognitive behavioral schools are undoubtedly the most prominent in psychotherapy. As a result, the dispute between them is the most dominant and intense in the field. Although nowadays the two schools consist of a cluster of theories and therapeutic methods, each of which again includes various tendencies at odds, there is still clear distinction in the general lines that characterize the mainstream of each of the approaches. The classic cognitive behavioral and psychodynamic approaches reflect profoundly different worldviews. Each school of thought represents a different and even clashing cultural tradition, understanding human suffering, the mind, therapeutic objectives, practices, and change processes. Hence, the main questions that concern us are, how can we motivate those for whom integration is not the focus of attention and even arouses strong opposition to dialogue? How can there be a dialogue between devoted believers of each school? And how can there be a mutual fertilization between two approaches that are so different from each other? Despite the efforts of the integration movement in recent decades to combine the two schools of thought, the rivalry between the schools continues to exist even today. Although most therapists do not believe that one approach is the most effective, and in practice they make use of contributions from other approaches, most remain identified with loyalty to a dominant school. Although the movement promoting psychotherapy integration has become international and is well-founded in an institution, journals, and research, in each school training programs, conference, and influential journals, there is almost no reference to the other approach. It seems that integration is happening among the integration community, while the two schools' leadership completely ignores each other. Integration is not at all on their agenda. The state of affairs is that political, social, and economic forces keep the participants within the monolithic school and lead them to avoid the contributions of alternative orientations. How can we explain the contempt and animosity that characterize the loyal followers of each group? We assume psychotherapy schools should be treated as cultural and ethnic communities based on Husserl's view. These communities give the community members a cultural professional identity based on the diagnosis of us versus them. That means therapists from each approach develop a cohesive and robust professional identity according to their belonging to the mother group. At the same time, the other school is seen as stranger and other. The cultural otherness not only helps in the formation of the professional identity, but also threatens the stability of this identity. The threat to this identity prevents community members from opening up to the other school for fear of blurring the identity. Each school needs to create and preserve a cultural professional identity with clear boundaries, which leads to the rejection of the other school. This distinction from the other school creates an oppositional and antagonistic position to other group. A superior, opposing attitude often arises in the school engagement instead of a desire to learn and curiosity. Loyalty to the restricted identity of the theoretical position leads to a narrow discourse, which there is a firm reputation of the same views. Under identity threat, the attitude of therapists who do not share the same theory is more like sinners than colleagues, whose opinions should be respected and studied. To seriously consider and examine theoretical and practical differences is considered unnecessary and even dangerous. We claim that the primary concern of the monolithic school is to drift in a different and foreign direction that will not preserve the central elements of the tradition, that will shake or blur the defined boundaries of its identity. To keep the school identity distinct and defined, strong forces of opposition and rejection arise. Hence, we recognize the threat to the community's identity as an obstacle to the psychotherapy integration movement. Therefore, we ask what can help reduce this threat and enable an encounter and mutual influence between the two rival psychotherapy schools without endangering their identities. This is a critical question for the integration movement to help loyalties on both sides of the barrier think about how an encounter with the other culture can take place and contribute significantly to them. Psychotherapy integration deals mainly with pragmatism and pluralism, though striving to establish theoretical and practical models that combine more than one approach to achieve maximal efficiency. Identifying obstacles to integration resistance among those loyal to different schools is not the focus of the field. Even when there are attempts to resolve it, it is based on the same values of pragmatism and pluralism, which do not overcome the persistent stance of the monolithic school loyalties. For example, let us turn to the argument about effectiveness. Despite significant research progress that has proven the effectiveness of each approach, moreover, despite research progress that has proven the effectiveness of shared therapeutic processes behind any approach, the research support did not help bring the schools closer together. Instead, it constituted another arena for the struggle between them. In addition, even the argument favoring pluralism is not enough, because the aspiration for pluralism, however just and politically correct it may be, is an aspiration that remains external to the profession and the patient needs in many ways. If principles of efficiency and pluralism do not help the approach's loyalties enough to open up to dialogue, what can help? We suggest the dialogue between cultural groups, between us and them, can be contributed by turning to the practice of encountering the other. Questions concerning the encounter with the other motivate us to turn to an extra-disciplinary source, which can complete this lacuna and provide an answer to a philosophy that deals with the encounter with the other. Philosophy deals with the questions of identity and otherness. How does the other affect our identities? How is a dialogue with the other possible? How can one be influenced by another without assimilating into it and without losing the security of identity? Since philosophy and psychotherapy are separate disciplines, joining them is not obvious. Kuhn holds that especially in times of crisis, it is recognized that scientists turn to philosophy as an analytical tool for solving puzzles in their field. For Kuhn, a philosophical examination is an integral contributor to the change processes when there is a crisis that the current paradigm guiding the field cannot resolve or explain. Turning to philosophy as an attempt to overcome a deficiency in psychotherapy integration is not a new attempt at all, but it is a limited attempt. Writing that deals with the connections between psychotherapy integration and philosophy offer, for the most part, a pluralistic position. In the spirit of postmodernism, it claims that there is more than one correct way to look at any phenomenon, and hence challenges the perception of truth. In theory, practice, and research, the pluralistic position is an important driving force in the integration processes to encourage rapprochement and exposure to different models. Still, this position does not refer to the threat of meeting the other and the fear inherent in the dissolution of the professional cultural identity. Neither the pluralist nor the pragmatic arguments for integration offer a proper response to the threat. It fails to address this threat which occurs prior to integration, at the point even before the encounter, which requires openness to the other, when one merely imagines the other and rejects his or her stance. It is this moment before the encounter, with all the hostility and antagonism it arouses and the barriers it erects, that interests us. This is the stage at which loyalties to the conflicting theories are presented with a theory that appears foreign, clashing, and radically different from the approach to which the therapist is accustomed and into which she or he received their professional induction. Before they begin to consider with an open mind what will most benefit their patients, therapists must feel on safe ground and not under threat. Following the appeal to philosophy, we will introduce Derrida's idea of hospitality and seek to connect the field of philosophy and the field of psychotherapy integration through the idea of integration as hospitality. Integration as hospitality is based on Derrida's concept of hospitality and offers a conscious and intentional encounter that preserves the identity of the school but allows openness to the other approach. This proposal seeks to offer a solution to the problem of closure and loyalty to the schools, to the threat to their identity, and to promote the efforts of the integration movement in the dialogue between the approaches. So first, we must explain what hospitality is. Hospitality for Derrida deals with the relationship between the self and the other, and is linked to crossing borders and dealing with internal-external relations. Hospitality is not about friends and family as we may be used to thinking about it. It deals with a member of another group, a member of another culture and another language. Derrida develops the concept of hospitality in his various writings under the influence of Levinas. In Derrida's view, hospitality is the root and essence of cultural and human ethics. Hospitality is defined as welcoming the stranger and the other into my own. However, Derrida dismantles the concept of hospitality in a critical and deconstructive way, to the ethical law and the political law. The ethical law is unconditional, where hospitality is open to all, and the other is always invited. On the other end, political hospitality laws are conditional laws that set limits for hospitality. The gap between the conditional and unconditional hospitality does not disintegrate the claim for hospitality, but is inseparable from it. This contradiction between conditional political and unconditional ethical laws exists in all hospitality. This contradiction of the double law is a paradox that cannot be resolved or reconciled. The unconditional law requires the regulating laws to become real, since they are the ones that make hospitality a concrete possibility. Who is invited, where to, and when? On the other end, conditional laws require ethical law. They draw inspiration from unconditional hospitality law, though the unconditional law and the conditional laws are interlinked. We can ask, why is it necessary to engage in such a complex way in hospitality? Where is the problem? Derrida emphasizes that there is a risk in hosting guests. Upon entering the threshold and crossing the border, the stranger undermines, questions, and shakes the dogmatism of the house owner. Therefore, for hospitality to be possible, the house owner must be in control of the guest. The political law is required to preserve the homeowner's control over his home, so that he does not turn from a host to a hostage. This control of the host over the guest is necessary for the host to be able to host. If the guest refuses to be under the host's control, then he refuses the act of hospitality. Hence, hospitality aims to welcome the other, but must have a dimension of patronage. Why then should we host and be guests despite these threats? What can both host and guest expect to gain when identity and ethos are challenged? Derrida answers that the question posed by the hospitality of the foreigner amounts to an invitation to the host to enter his own home. For Derrida, every concept includes its opposite. In French, the word hôte, I don't know if I pronounce it correctly, refers to both host and guest. This means that the host, convinced he is the master of the house, is the recipient of the hospitality he offers within his own home. Being host to his own hospitality sets him free from the alienation he experienced within his own home and situates him in it. While the questions that arise in the meeting with the visiting stranger can destabilize the home, they can confirm the answers in the host home and strengthen its boundaries. Moreover, there is a possibility that the answers will expand the boundaries of the house. So there is a possibility of enhancing the house borders and even expanding those boundaries. Derrida offers us an equation of risk versus chance. Both guest and host must take the hospitality risk for these gains to materialize. From the philosophy, we will move to its application in psychotherapy integration. It requires us to ask about hospitality in psychotherapy integration. Why is it worthwhile? The question of motivation. What are the conditions under which hospitality can be possible? The question of conditions. And how can it be displayed? The question of application. We will open in why. In the question dealing with the motivation for hospitality in psychotherapy integration. We can divide the motivation for hospitality into three states: identity constitution, identity endorsing, and identity expansion. We will start with identity establishment. According to Derrida, the foreigner not only threatens the self-identity of the cultural community, but is also the one who helps to set the self-identity. It is because self-constitution is always done by confronting the other. As mentioned, the encounter between us and them establishes the self-identity of each psychotherapeutic school. Even when they seek to reject this encounter, ignore one another, or submit to criticism. Hence, both psychotherapeutic schools constitute themselves as separate communities, establishes their identity from what they are and what they refuse to be. For instance, the cognitive behavioral approach rejects the notion of the unconscious. In contrast, psychoanalysis denies the idea of behavioral change that is not a part of unconscious dynamic processes at work. The second taste that motivates hospitality in psychotherapy integration is that the act of hospitality is also an opportunity to revisit one's own house. It situates the host within his own home and confirms its boundaries precisely due to the questioning guest appearance. Here, the opposing schools have an opportunity to boost and endorse their view due to hospitality itself. Let us imagine a cognitive behavioral lecturer, an expert on anxiety disorders. We have some of this here. A psychoanalytic institute invites her to give a talk. The lecturer presents behavioral techniques of exposure. The encounters aims not to cause psychoanalysts to abandon the worldviews they believe in, but rather to better understand their approach, elaborate it from a different perspective. For instance, one might perceive interpretation as exposure to painful emotions or thoughts, an improvement in terms of practice and adjustments. Members of the Psychoanalytic Institute gained further confirmation of how their treatment can help patients in ways they did not foresee. So, an intelligent discourse between the host and the guest brings up questions and generates answers, reinforcing the hosting tendencies, perspectives, and practices. Last, for Derrida, hospitality opens the possibility to expand the home. It carries the potential gain of creative development for the hosting orientation. Under certain conditions we will discuss later, the invited school may leave behind constructive ideas and practices that can inspire new ideas within the host's existing frame. Let us continue our last example about the cognitive behavioral lecturer invited to speak about anxiety at the Psychoanalytic Institute. The psychoanalytic audience may think about combining exposure techniques with treating anxiety along with the traditional treatment. Another example of expanding the boundaries of the house can be seen in different models of integrative assimilation, which we will discuss later in the question of application. If so, the idea of hospitality invites therapists from both schools to a meeting where one cultural community hosts the other. This meeting establishes, boosts, and expands the identity of each of the schools, how they view the world, the person, the therapy, and the applied practices. All this, however, can only happen on one condition. The audience must not feel threatened. They must not think that their professional identity is being questioned, interfering with the very foundation of their home. After dealing with why we need hospitality in the field of psychotherapy integration, we will move on to the question of what. What conditions allow such hospitality in the field of psychotherapy integration? As mentioned, hospitality between the competing schools in psychotherapy is threatened by impending dangers such as internal revolution, foreign overtake, assimilation, conversion, and even destruction of the cultural ethos. The guest who the competent school is hosting is under a familiar threat. Therefore, ethical hospitality alone, completely unconditional, is not possible and amounts to absolute madness. One must, in other words, approach the intellectual and theoretical other and lend an ear to different voices. At the same time, one should act responsibly by checking out which alien elements may be admitted to the home's cultural narrative and by articulating conditions and constraints. In our case, the question of the conditions requires agreeing on who the inviter is and who is the invitee. Both schools must agree to this invitation. It is the school that undertakes the hosting, the master of the house, that is the ruler setting the rules of this meeting, the invitation's timing, what the guest may bring alone, and what it might carry in, which ideas and practices, and on which specific topics it is welcome to discuss. When the Psychoanalytic Institute, for instance, invites a guest lecture from a cognitive behavioral therapist, the invitation is to a specific speaker who is welcome to join at a particular time and place and discuss an agreed topic. It is most likely that when such an invitation is not accepted and the guest independently decides on terms of the encounter, he or she will probably be perceived as an intruder. Another critical condition is that hospitality is always done in the host language. The host who welcomes the guest into his home welcomes the guest into his language. This language expresses the entirety of his culture. One school that hosts its opponents conducts discourse in a language familiar to it and understands the ideas and concepts of the other school through the same mother tongue. The rival school must agree to be hosted and discuss its ideas and concepts in the language of the hosting school. Though, when the cognitive behavioral lecturer is hosted at the Psychoanalytic Institute, she will be understood and asked in the language familiar to the Institute members. Her concepts will be translated into this language of psychoanalytic terms. The language would be, for example, a language of unconscious conflicts and internalized objects and how this affects emotional experience, interpersonal relations, and functioning. Concepts such as behavioral activation or exposure will be understood through this prism. An act of translation, an act of interpretation takes place here, but this action does not reduce the value of hospitality. This action exists in every human situation and in the therapeutic situation itself. Another condition, the last condition, we must not pass is that hospitality does not involve similarity, fusion, or unification. The otherness is a condition for hospitality. This condition means that there is a distance and separation between me and the other, and that I will never be him. Hospitality preserves the separation between me and the other and does not reduce it. This condition is critical when we deal with rival psychotherapeutic schools. For hospitality to take place, they must recognize and maintain their separateness and uniqueness, though the threat for assimilation, conversion, union, or destruction is removed. Only by this, expanding the house's boundaries will be possible. It is an important point. If therapists from both schools want hospitality to be successful, they must acknowledge and cultivate their distinct and separate characters. This way, the techniques of one approach and ideas will not be considered a part of the hosting approach, even when they are understandable and deployed in a language. For example, the members of the Psychoanalytic Institute will be able to use exposure techniques presented by the cognitive behavioral lecturer, but exposure will not be considered a psychodynamic technique. In this manner, the fear of conversion or unification is addressed. After talking about why should we welcome guests and the condition under which hospitality is possible, we will move on to the question of how. That deals with the implanting of hospitality in the field of psychotherapy integration between the two competing schools. The importance of the idea of integration as hospitality is not being a purely theoretical concept, but in the practical application possibilities inherent in it. The question here is how we can use the idea of hospitality to enrich the possibilities of encounters between school loyalties while maintaining their separateness. How can we apply the ethical law that welcomes the other, and the political laws that condition the entry of ideas and intervention of the opposing school. The answer is that hospitality may take many forms. It is always the product of a negotiation between the law of ethics and the political laws that condition it. For example, within the integration movement, it is practiced within the assimilative integration model. This type of integration requires a firm grounding in one psychotherapeutic system, an openness to include practices and views deriving from another system selectively. For instance, the psychodynamic assimilation model or the cognitive behavioral assimilative model are intellectually reliant on and faithful to their respective original theories. Adhering to their mother tongue and home ground enables them to direct their hospitality to specific components of the competing perspective. The latter is perceived as offering ways to expand the traditional model, though other elements are rejected and remain outside. In doing so, they maintain the tension between the ethical and political laws and represent different hospitality expressions in psychotherapy. For clinicians, to further open their doors to other rival schools, it is essential that from the outset the encounter should not present itself as dispute or an attempt to reduce differences. It should set itself up as meeting between hosts who come to listen and talk with guests and engage in an honest debate, allowing for both disagreement and openness. We suggest that each time one of the schools take the stage on study days or conference, a competent school representative will be invited to offer their perspective. Hospitality can also be practiced in written form, in journals or in books, when the other side is asked to present its views on the issue in question, and it can enter professional training institutes through their curricula, which might invite from time to time to host professionals from the other school. We believe, therefore, that hospitality can be exercised at any level we choose, in the discussion about our worldview and theory, about our practices, research, training, and writings, as long as we keep the tension of the double law between ethics and politics. In this way, we believe that the level of threat of blurring the cultural professional identity will decrease and allow openness, listening, and influence between psychotherapeutic school loyalties. Finally, the idea of hospitality in psychotherapy integration asks not to reduce otherness between the schools, but to preserve the integration as a bridge to dialogue processes between different approaches. The purpose is to give respect and value to each therapeutic tradition's identity, while encouraging an open, curious, and creative position in dialogue with the other. The integration development also lies in the preservation of otherness. The other is critical to the school's development and the integration movement itself. In this workshop, we are getting to the end, friends. In this workshop, we invite you to host in your professional home and to be hosted in the professional homes of the other workshop participants. The first 2 days of the workshop will be divided into 5 panels of 2 participants. Each panel consists of participants representing different professional homes: a psychoanalytic psychodynamic home, a cognitive behavioral home, or an integrative home. In each panel, you will be asked to host in your professional home and be hosted in the other's professional home. At the end of each panel, time will be set aside for a discussion where the participants can debate their ideas, and at the same time, the watching participants will also be invited to participate in the discussion. The purpose of the discussion is to examine the questions arising from the idea of hospitality in psychotherapy integration. Questions such as: did you understand something new about the theory and practice with which you identify? Did the lecture support your theoretical and practical position by giving you a new perspective on it? Are there theoretical or practical foreign components to your professional home that you found interesting? How can these components be explained by the theory you hold, and would you be interested in incorporating them into your professional work, and so on? The workshop purpose is to allow each participant to present the main points of the theory and practice in which he believes, and to create dialogue between the different approaches. We believe that a meeting like this can also encourage the school's loyalties to later invite to their professional home, and not only on neutral ground. The idea of integration as hospitality will allow, in our opinion, a way to overcome the threat of encounters and for entire communities to host a different approach without giving up the therapeutic principles that each community believes. On the one hand, the purpose is to preserve the self-identity of the schools and enable an informed strengthening of the existing cultural ethos. At the same time, the aim is to open the door, allow listening, and contribute to an enriching and vital development in psychotherapy, theory, practice, and research. The last day, we will dedicate the last day of the workshop to each participant's perception of the challenges of psychotherapy integration today and its vision for its advancement. After, we will devote time to a joint discussion and produce a document concerning the conclusions arising from the workshop and the idea of hospitality in psychotherapy integration. We thank you for listening, your efforts to come to the workshop, and your readiness and openness to host and be hosted. We wish you a fascinating and fruitful workshop, and we hope that this hospitality will lead to contribution and enrichment, and will lead to its application behind this workshop as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yael, for this illuminating presentation. So, now that you all know about the workshop, about the philosophy behind it, about what the experiment and what we like to achieve, we assume that all of you have thoughts and ideas about dialogue between the schools. And we would like to hear what you think about the workshop, what you think about this experiment, what are your first ideas here in the opening. And you are invited to say anything that comes to your mind.
First of all, thank you for putting this together, and I'm coming to this with excitement. I came to thinking about this and reading the instructions that you sent along the way with excitement, and also with this feeling of like, am I even buying the premise? Do I agree with the very basic premise of this metaphor working or not? And I was wondering, as you were talking, there were some assumptions there about the fact that we each have a home, and that home defines us, and that identity is important to us and to our professional communities. And maybe I'm already showing my cards as from the integration camp, in thinking that I'm not sure I agree. I'm not sure I have a home. I think I'm okay with not having a home. And I think that maybe there are differences between these schools in how much they see themselves as schools, and how much they in fact are, organized as schools or not. So I'm I like the metaphor and I don't like the metaphor at the same time, and it goes further. It's the metaphor of a house, the metaphor of host, who owns the house. The title you had at some point for the workshop was a psychoanalyst and a cognitive behavioral therapist meet on a plane, and I was thinking, who owns the plane, right? So who's the host there? It's Delta Airlines, or like, and really where we meet is in our patients' lives. They're the host. We're guests there, and for us to define homes, so that's where my thinking is right now.
So yeah, I want to join Eshkol in thanking you for putting it together. I know how much work goes into that, and I'm really grateful that you took it upon yourselves. And I also want to join Eshkol in kind of from the outset thinking maybe in my perception in different ways about this meeting and its goals, because again, I'm happy that Eshkol mentioned our patients, but our patients were absent from the introduction of the meeting, and I think, again, they are the invisible other in our meeting, right? We are here to discuss the ways in which we can better their lives in different ways, and I do believe that this is more of a collaboration than just visiting one another, because we are, I believe, and correct me later on if that's not so, that we have a mutual goal of bettering their lives and enhancing their well-being. So the concept of hosting is a bit, I mean, maybe the person as a host, the patient as a host could be a great metaphor for that. And also my thoughts were, as I was jotting them down here, and I'll only mention one, is that in my mind there is not a real rift between CBT and psychodynamic therapy. I think we both, in more ways than one, there is already a collaboration between the empirical branches of both approaches. So I know that Golan, who is not here, and Sigal Zilkamana, both are great researchers in the psychodynamic approaches to psychopathology and to treatment. And I think we share everything. I mean, I will not speak for the friends that I know here, but I share all the assumptions that they have. So mechanisms of change are crucial to understanding how we work, and they are to be examined empirically. And so the real divide in my mind is not between psychodynamic and psychoanalytic approaches and CBT, but between the empiricism and the non-empiricism. This is a real divide in my mind, and this requires really a meeting of minds to understand what each approach offers the other. So maybe I'll stop here, but that's kind of my initial thought.
So it's interesting because I think I tend to go where Eshkol and Eva went in terms of that the patient should be the focus, and at the same time listening to you, I was not so there. I was much more thinking about this metaphor of hosting, and what does it mean to host exactly. I actually, my family, we host people all the time in our house for Shabbat meals, for example. It led me to think about what is my goal when I host. We host people from different religions, from different cultures, all the time for a Shabbat meal. And on the one hand, if the guests are native Hebrew speakers, we actually speak their language and not our own. So it raised the question for me about, is it really necessary that the host use their mother tongue? And then I think it partially is related to the question of what is the goal of hosting? And I think it's hard not to make the parallel between religion and theoretical orientation in different ways. When I'm hosting a Shabbat meal, I'm hosting my religious practice, at least, as part of what we're doing. And it's an interesting question because it raises questions even about integration itself. most, if we take a parallel, Judaism and Christianity, both more or less reject Jews for Jesus, which is kind of an integration of the two religions. And there's a tension that I think you're identifying, right? That everyone's trying to maintain their own identity and share, and yet, for sure, the most fundamentalists will say, no, you're not welcome in my home, or you're welcome to be in my home as a viewer, but not as a participant. And the more, I think, the less threatened one feels, the more people are actually open to really trying to share ideas and invite people fully. And I think actually even the Jew who invites a non-Jew into their home is not trying to convert them to Judaism necessarily. They're really, if anything, just trying to say, here's who I am, and I hope you can accept me for who I am. While at times, at least, a Christian who's inviting someone to their home may be having the goal of actually converting the person who they're bringing to adopt their own beliefs. And they may do it very gently and with loving kindness. And so it even raises a question of what is the goal that one has when they're hosting? And how do those goals maybe end up leading to different dialogues and different attempts in different ways? So those are just some of my thoughts that came as you were speaking.
Oh, yeah. Well, hey, we go to the same barber, don't we? Yeah, I'm not at all uncomfortable. I think it's a brilliant idea to bring people together from different perspectives. And it is an experiment, but the whole notion is that you don't feel threatened. It's supposed to be an engagement. And so the notion is, what are we going to learn from each other? And so when you enter into it that way, you're already entering into it from a benign openness. And there's another expectation, and that's of mutual recognition. And so you're not there necessarily, I'm going to qualify that, to have a big debate, because you're here to have a good meal together. Just like Eden's going to give me some restaurants in Haifa where I commented about the fusion of culture and food. But at the same time, your point's well taken, that is this, do we have to set aside this notion of our identity or our over-identification with our identity? And is it really a religion? In some circles, definitely, I think, particularly psychoanalysis can be very much a cult, not just a religion. And you have to kind of, define yourself in different ways within that framework. But no, not just, okay. Well, I mean, from my experience is that even within psychoanalysis, they're deeply divided based upon their identification with a particular school, and the hermeneutics of suspicion is raised the minute you say, I'm a fusion of this, and this. But anybody who has gone through years of training and experience, our identities are completely different than when we first entered into our studies. So the notion, like for instance, when you're talking, I was trained in the 80s, so CBT didn't exist then. Whatever did exist tended to be cognitive or behavioral, but not a fusion. We had separate classes, but we used to call integration eclecticism. And so these things have kind of evolved in different languages, but Anyway, I don't want to blab on and on, but I just wanted to comment that I don't see it as a threat on the condition that you're here to learn and be friendly. If you get your back up and you're there to have a fight or debate, then you kind of defeated the whole point of being here.
Thank you. I want to continue your thoughts, John, because I think the assumption that a home is only homey is of course quite disturbing, because it's very optimistic. Every home is also unheimliche in a way, and I think when you visit a psychoanalytic society, you see that it's not a family and not such a homey place. So I think the dichotomy assumption that it's there is one home and then there is another home, I do believe it's not so. It's not like that, and that even in my mind, the home is changing all the time. The theoretical home, I change, so my theoretical view is changing also. So, yeah. Thank you.
First of all, thank you for a very interesting introduction. I got the assignment from Aner and Yael, and I struggled with the decision to which home do I belong, because practically, especially I think a lot of therapists that treat children, they move from one technique to another, one philosophy to another. Otherwise, I think they can't do their job. But when we come to a meeting like this, we're expected to have an opinion, and we're expected to argue, and we're expected to protect something that practically in our clinics we don't. We live, I think, pretty good with ourselves in peace. But in many seminars, courses, you need to have an opinion, and it has to be opposed to somebody else's. So I think maybe what we can do here, hopefully, is to stop arguing and to allow ourselves the ability to move from opinions and theories the way we actually do in practice.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for the invitation to come, and it's really nice to be back in Israel again, with everything that there is in Israel. And also thank you really for that talk, which I thought was very stimulating, as have all the comments been so far. Just to add a couple of things to, a high level of agreement with what's been said, and also to note that I haven't done any clinical work now for 20 years. So I'm coming at some of this material from the more theoretical or philosophical or even non-empirical position, and that might be interesting to think about, and there may be others in a similar position. Just 3 quick points that have come up for me. Firstly, I so strongly agree with the issue about how the assumption that one's home is a peaceful place, that is a big assumption. I mean, not just Freud's, narcissism of minor differences, but we know most murders take place within the family. So it's within that group that vast numbers of tension arise. And just think about Jews. We think from the outside, people talk about Jews as if we're one group, and from the inside, we know we are more groups than the actual number of people. So I think we should think about that quite carefully, and it relates, of course, to the point that you were making, El, about how we forge our identities partly by creating an external force which opposes us and makes us more homogeneous than we actually are. But I think we need to think that through, and certainly, here in this group, for instance, there's myself very affiliated intellectually, at least, to psychoanalysis, and there are Jungians. And the history of that relationship has not been a neat an easy and comfortable one. At least as uncomfortable, probably even more uncomfortable than the relationship between the psychodynamic understood generally in CBT. So that's one point about where the fault lines might lie. The second point, I just wanted to reiterate what I thought several people have said, so I won't labour it, but just about this relationship, the complicated relationship between hospitality and ownership. And certainly something I've felt quite strongly thinking about this conference, and maybe we'll come back to on Wednesday if it hasn't become irrelevant by then, or Thursday rather, if it hasn't become irrelevant by then, which is that to my mind hospitality really does imply some ownership. You invite somebody into something that you've got. I think the Shabbat example is a brilliant one in trying to think about a model for this. And of course it can be embracing and open and also allow yourself to be challenged in the way that you were saying before, Albert. It nevertheless assumes that somebody has got a home that they do invite other people into, and yet the ownership of the land, here we are in Israel, the ownership of the land is incredibly contentious. And maybe just to flag it up at the moment without developing it. I mean, I've been thinking, along with my readings of Judith Butler, about the alternative model of cohabitation, where people share something, where we find ourselves together but don't necessarily own it, and trying to think about what difference that might make. A third space, a space of witnessing, perhaps, which I do think this space might even be. But we can come back to that. But I think there are alternative ways of thinking about the general notion you have in mind around inviting people in an open way in order to embrace something different, which also resists the idea that somebody has entitlement over others. And the third and final point I just want to make now is just about this question of threat and comfort. In a way, of course, I agree. I think in a way it's obvious that if you're feeling highly threatened, you're less likely to be open to others' views. You need to defend yourself. So it's not like I dispute that. But I wonder if it's fair to think about creating boundaries, creating spaces of safety as a sine qua non for change. And I suppose I was thinking again, something we might discuss, an alternative model might be the spaces of vulnerability, the issues of shared vulnerability. Again, we can think about that in the context of Israel. We could think about it, I'm trying to think about it at the moment in the context of the relationship between contesting anti-Semitism and contesting anti-black racism. Highly fraught dynamic. And it seems to me one of the possibilities there is to think about the shared histories of vulnerability that produce the necessity for forming a kind of alliance which makes it possible to confront various modes of oppression. That's writ large, of course, but I wonder if the same type of thinking might occur in what is a very vulnerable space, the space of preserving high-quality psychotherapeutic, of any kind, psychotherapeutic communities which respect the actual needs of people who one might think of as one's patients or clients. Sorry about the huge delay, crowded rooms, and not so hospitable sound system in this university.
I also would like to thank you very much. I'm really honored to be here. This is not formal thinking, but it's a sincere feeling. I've been invited to this table, and congratulations for this piece that you presented, Yael. A lot of words made sense to me and are in dialogue with my work. The term monolithic, and you will understand tomorrow, the idea of the hospitality as ethical law and as political law, as something that enlarge and restrict the margins for hospitality. This is really enlightening. And this is very relevant, this work and the idea of hospitality and the way you thought this kind of workshop is very relevant to me because I'm working with asylum seekers and with very traumatized asylum seekers. And when you work with trauma, you need help. You need help from other perspectives, from other ideas, from other experiences. No theory is self-sufficient. I would like to thank you also for this round of reflections that is not concluded, but a lot of ideas I'm feeling are still around, going around. So thank you very much.
When he wrote about refugees.
And I'll just say a couple of words. Just thank you so much for the invitation, for the opportunity to be here. I think it's a really interesting experiment, just like you said. And as all experiments, you can't really tell how it will go. It's part of the nice thing about not knowing. And I don't have a lot to add, over and above what everyone else has already said, but I will say that, like, something forward thinking is that I'm really, really curious to hear about, how you guys work and what you do and how that relates to what I do. And I think it's a wonderful opportunity. We don't get many of those. To really kind of look at the way other people work and see what we can learn. So I'm excited about that. Thank you.
We're doing a roundtable discussion about what everyone thinks about this, the workshop and the philosophy behind that, and the expectation from that, and we'll soon get to you. Yes, that's just after the presentation. Thank you very much, all of you, for your comments. I already have some new ideas from you that I didn't think of. First of all, not everyone feels comfortable in a compartment in a home, and these homes might change from time to time. And the definition of a home, of a professional home, is not so distinct. And let me just tell you that I come from a psychoanalytic institute. I was trained from the start as a clinical psychology in the psychodynamic approach, and I also know the literature between the CBT and the psychodynamic, and the rifts and the frictions, and so I think this is part of this personal view of mine and my experience that there is in the psychoanalytic world is very divided, is very polarized. And although today we live in a pluralist world and a postmodern world, many clinicians pay lip service for pluralist philosophy, but actually believe they have a monopoly on the truth and how to treat patients and what is good for patients. And this happens even within the camp of psychoanalysis. And although it's true that there are researchers, empirical researchers in CBT and psychodynamic, empirical research, it's a good example, and Golan will maybe have more things to say about it, is a tiny fraction of the psychoanalytic activity. And they are a very sort of secluded camp within the psychoanalytic world, which I think is a shame. And so most psychodynamic psychotherapists and CBT, by the way, from surveys that has been made, are not interested in empirical research, and they don't read much about it. So this is the idea of things that you say the patient is missing here, and you're right. But what is the patient? How do we define suffering of a patient? What is human suffering? What is psychopathology? What does it mean to help a patient? These are questions that are very controversial between the different approaches and the different schools. And each of you have sort of assumptions about these questions. and different assumptions from other people that are sitting here, and that this exchange is what most interests us here. Golan, would you please say some words about what you think about this workshop or expectations for the length of this mutual exchange?
I'm very grateful for you, Aner, for initiating this very unique, peculiar maybe, gathering. It is construed as a reapproachment or a dialogue or a conversation between psychoanalysis or the psychoanalytic / psychodynamic point of view on the one hand and CBT on the other hand. I'm not sure. I tend to think that this is, while understandable, somewhat outdated. Someone growing up within the psychoanalytic camp, tribe, I see many of my CBT-born colleagues here with whom I have outrageous agreements on so many aspects of psychopathology, psychotherapy. It was so ecstatic to fight over these issues years ago. And the fun is over, I think, to a great extent, because I really believe that we're in agreement. We're in philosophically, empirically. We agree much more than we disagree. We still belong to different sociologies, political systems that are incredibly enticing, seducing to think about it psychoanalytically. And I think these systems, they are the ones that provide the greatest barriers for an effective dialogue. And in my putative home, the psychoanalytic home, the school where I feel I know the most, but also feel more comfortable, the politics sheds light on why the psychoanalytic establishment is not interested in research, hence not interested in other approaches that come from research-based perspectives. So I believe that this gathering is important merely by its existence, and the kind of people you amassed here are a treat to meet. I have trepidations that you will be disappointed by the extent of agreement that you will approach here. And perhaps because of that, and given my contrarian personality, I decided to challenge the mere concept of home, but that's for later.
Let me just say that I think there is another home, which is academic psychology, and to academic psychology shared by CBT and psychodynamic, and they share a mutual views together, and they believe in empirical research. There is a huge psychoanalytic literature that eschews empirical research, and that think that that case studies are the most important valid information for at least psychoanalysis. And you probably know all this debate. So I think there is another home of academic psychology but most of psychoanalysis and maybe also CBT clinicians are not part of academic psychology, and they talk in parallel. They rarely meet. So I think that's another thing that adds to the complicated issue here and makes it even more interesting. That there are it's not just psychodynamic or psychotherapists, but also other issues and what you think about other issues. And then one of the biggest issues is empirical research. Okay, anyone wants to comment? Can we take a break?
I just wanted to thank you for engaging with those of us who are linguistically challenged, making this in English, and to acknowledge what a colonial kind of a colonial approach that is on the part of those of us who are indeed, as I say, linguistically challenged.